Nous sommes très honorés que Brian Hiffer ait accepté de conclure ces 2 journées. Brian Hiffer est historienne de l'art, critique et commissaire d'exposition, professeure à University College of London depuis 2005. Elle est auteure de nombreux ouvrages et spécialiste d'un grand nombre d'artistes femmes. Je citerai en particulier Eva Hesse, mais également, évidemment, Louise Bourgeois, dont elle a accompagné l'exposition de cet été au Metropolitan Museum d'un magnifique essai dans le catalogue et à partir de l'œuvre de laquelle elle prépare une grande exposition à Oslo en 2023.
Merci. Brian. Bonjour à tous. Merci aux organisateurs aussi, à Hélène, Valentin, aussi Clio. Je suis ravie d'être là parmi vous et je vais parler assez informellement au sujet de mon exposition de Louise Bourgeois, mais aussi aux idées qui attachent à ce projet. Je passe en anglais. I hope you're not too warm. I'll try to keep it short. But I wanted to make it a little mélange in a way. Hélène asked me both to speak a little about the exhibition that I'm co-curating, but also to think a little bit about the themes that we've been discussing. And I mean, a conclusion is slightly an exaggeration of what I'm going to be doing, but hopefully to make some remarks that are suggestive. So the museum that I'm co-curating with Andrea Kroksnes, who's senior curator at the National Museum in Oslo, Louise Bourgeois Imaginary Conversations, is going to open in May next year, kind of sudden panic, 2023. And it's been delayed 2 years. I feel I've lived it for so many years, but it's been delayed 2 years, partly because of the pandemic and partly because of their new building, their rather wonderful new building. So it's a retrospective of Louise Bourgeois, a particular sort, entre deux, more, entre plusieurs, even more, entre autres. I guess we've thought of it as an exploded version of a retrospective, where we try to open the work of Bourgeois to the work of others. Of course, it's not that hasn't been done before in certain ways, but on this scale, we're trying to do something rather ambitious. And of course, the work on the artists, not least by scholars who are here and who we've been listening to in the last couple of days, have already shifted our attention to the in-between in such rich and suggestive ways, and to what happens in the encounter with the work of another. In this instance, I guess, at the heart, the work of Szapocznikow, such that thinking in this way, thinking through these encounters, our understanding of the work of both artists is, we hope, reciprocally transformed in some complex way. So in Louise Bourgeois Imaginary Conversations, we incorporate a series of encounters of this type. A key one is with Szapocznikow and Bourgeois, of course, at the heart of this exhibition. But we also make the whole exhibition into a web of connections, interweaving the work of other artists with Bourgeois over the course of her work, from the 1940s through to her death. So loosely based on a chronological thread that runs from start to finish, there are multiple temporal registers that cut across it. And the term, I'm sure you know, imaginary conversations, comes comes from Joaquin Gasquet in his own imaginary conversations with Cézanne. Now, this is a wall of drawings on Bourgeois' wall in a photograph apparently taken in 1962. But for me, it's also served as a kind of map, a kind of landscape, a kind of web, too. But for now, let's think of it as a kind of cartographic mapping of relationships that crisscross point to point, but are also interchangeable, insofar as the artist would move the walls on the drawing around, even take it with her as she moved around across the Atlantic. Not least, as Maggie Wright has so generously shared with me from the archive, you know, when she was in France, for instance, she would make another kind of corresponding wall of drawings, another wall that approximates to it. And some of the drawings, of course, date right back to the 1940s, and some remain there, or they get rearranged, or they get replaced by others. It's a kind of arachnoid method, to invoke Leah Wong's wonderful paper yesterday. And that way of thinking is something that has kind of informed our approach. What I'm wanting to talk about today is less the exhibition as such, and more some of the ideas that attach to it and obviously link so intimately to all the questions and thinking that's been going on for the last 2 days in this warm auditorium. So I kind of want to go back a little to ask what it is to do what we're trying to do, what it is to think in between. To think a little bit about some of the issues we've been discussing, but perhaps to open it on to some others as well. Trying to think, I guess, from my own point of view, not just about creating different narratives that explain things for us, but rather to create different forms of friction, perhaps could we call it, if not outright confrontation, certain sort of antagonistic encounters that involve some kind of friction or cutting against the grain of, between different temporal registers, in a way that makes it rather hard, obviously hard, and I think in a way that's so interesting, the way that's played out over the course of the 2 days. It's impossible to stay within 2 decades. You know, the whole idea of the decade is something that you spill out of necessarily in this way of thinking. And arguably temporal registers. And Matilda brought up this question of time, I thought, very suggestively on day 1. But for us, you know, this idea of temporal registers, you know, somatic, psychic registers included, these are the registers that the work of Bourgeois, for sure, and I think also so clearly Szapocznikow too, they so amply dramatize, let's put it like that for the moment. The way Joe Aplin talked about aging, for instance, not in terms of a biography, but rather in a way that cuts against the grain of our notion of a biographical narrative. So what I want to try to keep in mind here is this sense of an ever-evolving and in certain cases, ever unraveling or undoing process in mind, which leads me to, I guess, inevitably and quite properly, to all the elements that fall out of place, as well as the ones that confirm what we think we know of the transformations in art at that extended historical juncture of the 60s and 70s. Or sometimes kind of situate themselves both inside and outside of those parameters at one and the same time. there's a phrase from George Kubler, who I'm sure you know, who's writing in the early 60s, The Shape of Time. I'm sure you know it, but he talks about the fibrous structure of time. And for me, that idea of almost a fee, this idea of a line, a thread, a filament, this idea of a kind of bundle of lines or filaments, I think is interesting, both to think about in relation to a wall of drawing such as this, but also to the problem of time that we are addressing here. So it also lends itself perhaps to thinking slightly differently about that sense of trajectories, kind of multiple trajectories weaving together rather than one single path of development. I was particularly interested in Szapocznikows' photographic sculptures from this point of view, and they also seem a little bit, I mean, it's not the same as the wall of drawings, obviously, but, this idea of acting out through a photographic series, the making and remaking of sculpture, the unmaking, rather, and remaking of sculpture in so many different versions of itself, which arguably play out so many possibles in the plural, in miniature, using gum that she's chewed and spat out. So this sense of being in series, looking backwards and looking forwards, ricocheting between the two. This is the installation of the 2012 show As It Was at the Hammer. Over the last couple of days, we've obviously seen different possible ways of thinking relations between works, as in the direct engagement of one artist with the work of another, as in the correspondences that could be thought from work to work. Sorry, I'm not keeping up with my own slides here. So this idea of thinking correspondences, or what it is to think of a relation between these works that's potentially indirect and potentially creating a certain friction one with the other rather than a seamless connection. This is a very poor slide, sorry, of Bourgeois' amoeba from 63 to 65. And here it is in a slightly less familiar iteration over her mantelpiece in her house, alongside her, of course, wearing that latex piece, the cast of Avenza, that we've already looked at in several of the talks. But I'm interested in the way in which, this idea of the work being always evolving, rather than the definition or the meaning of the work being, as art historians, we tend to assume, attached to the point of its production. Okay? So I immediately want to use that example to try to show how, why would we imagine that the original meaning of the work is the one that we should, as art historians, be digging for? How can we accommodate some much more complex sense of an ever-evolving entity? And the same would happen, I guess, the same point seems to me important in relation to surrealism, or the status of surrealism in the way that we're thinking this, or the status of biomorphism. Because in some ways one has to think of the evolution or even the exhaustion, I think, or different patterns of what happens to surrealism by this point. What status can it occupy in our thinking at this moment? And I just show you this rather wonderful image from Dorothea Tanning's Paris show that was held at the end of the 60s, these wonderful photographs using the coloured filters of her textile work. Of course, that she's, in a way, she's the most obviously defined as a surrealist artist, Dorothea Tanning. Bourgeois and Tanning knew each other obviously in the 40s, but here in a way we have Tanning in the late 1960s working in textiles, stuffing textiles in a way that Bourgeois herself will not do till much later, to the 90s or the 2000s. And so what I'm interested in is also a history not just of a continuation of certain stylistic or different ideological or artistic movements, but rather the delays and deferments that we might be able to imagine as part of this almost a history of interruptions, I guess, rather than seamless continuation. So I'm trying to just give some instances of these, how these multiple temporal registers and flows might feed into our thinking, even if they're not synchronous with one another, but they are kind of co-evolving with each other across time. They often kind of fall out of time in some significant way. I myself have been working with the idea of the chronotope for some years, the idea of the chronotope, which is a brilliant formulation of the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin. I'm sure you're familiar with his notion of the carnivalesque and the dialogic, but his notion of his theory of the novel that is based around the idea of the chronotope is much less known. The chronotope for Bakhtin is often a trope or motif that can be observed in formation, or else it's kind of ebbing away in these larger overarching cultural movements. The chronotope, in my use of it, has everything to do with contingency, and contingency is also the key word for me in how we kind of navigate these waters. Contingency, as Michael Newman once put it, I thought very eloquently, contingency, he said, is the touch paper of circumstance. So it's that kind of these points of touch, of connection between work and world that are never fixed points. So contingency is always some kind of mobile concept, and it's a way of describing the in-between. So for me, this idea of the chronotope is a way of describing the relation between work and world. Chronotope literally means time-space. It was actually coined by a scientist, a Russian scientist, Ukhtomsky, a biologist in the 1920s. It's taken up by Bakhtin much later in the late 1930s, at a point when he's been persecuted, he's been forced into exile by the Stalinist regime. So the term itself has traveled over time. So in one sense, that's also important to me. That term has a history, and it's recently been reinvigorated, really very interestingly, I think, in the work of Huey Copeland and Krista Thompson, in their attempt to reconfigure the recurrent motif within their concept of a new black aesthetics. And they draw very explicitly on Bakhtin's chronotope. I'm thinking about it rather differently. I'm not really using it to refer exclusively to a recurrent motif as such, but rather to these multiple points of connection that I'm trying to describe between work and world, to try to sort of catch something, something less tangible and a little more mobile as the work intersects with world in time, and so in an ever-evolving and ever-shifting way. You know, it's clearly quite hard to keep the temporal aspect of the work defined in this way, so utterly dependent as it has to be and embedded in contingency, within the conventional blocks of time that we tend to like to think with, for instance, a year, a decade, even a continent, certainly a period, an artistic period or movement. I'm moving around because I want to give the sense of something almost alarmingly slippery involved in thinking in this way. This is, in a way now, a work by, you might know the work of the Senegalese artist Seni Awa Kamara. I know it's been exhibited in Paris, and there's a concrete connection here. But I think not only a concrete fact, where Louise Bourgeois writes in the 1990s a little piece on Seni Awa Kamara, okay, on a book in contemporary African art. And that piece, she doesn't write about that many artists, but she writes about a few, Gaston Lachaise and Kamara, and a few others. But it comes off the back of La Magicienne de la Terre, that we need to know, from the mid 89, sorry, thank you, Sarah. Louise Bourgeois and Kamara were both in La Villette, so they were both involved in that exhibition. Bourgeois never actually comes, but she's pleased to be in that exhibition, as I understand it. But she writes about Kamara, and it does come out of that moment very much. And as I'm sure you know, Magicien de la Terre didn't just incorporate, but presented non-Western artists, the term that was used at the time, alongside Western artists in what I felt at the time was a highly problematic way, but it's clearly been and proven a pivotal moment in some important respects. So she was asked to write it. But it's notable, I think, her refusal of the term primitivism, and that despite the fact of her husband, Robert Goldwater's famous book on the subject. And much earlier than this, much earlier, she'd invoked in an interview of the 60s, her antagonism to that term. She never liked that term. And so, in addition, I think, rather than timeless, as this work is so often seen to be, Kamara's clay work, a medium, incidentally, Bourgeois really didn't like. She tried it, she hated it. There are obvious correspondences that we might imagine drew Bourgeois to this work. The repetitive protrusions, often these little monsters, the joining, even blurring of male and female figures, as she puts it, how they nestle together. But what Bourgeois is interested in is, as she puts it, these players in the theatre of everyday life. In the flow of 20th century life, she doesn't just imply, but states pretty clearly. She relates this to Kamara's other work, where Kamara makes little models of, transportation, tractors, different vehicles, and motorbikes, and so on. So this is a kind of modern version of the African artist. So without it being particularly specific, I don't want to kind of talk about it in a way that doesn't ring true with what Bourgeois actually said. I think it's interesting how she casts this work in a way that really does cut against the grain of certain prevalent ideas about primitivism, certainly that she had grown up with. And she speaks, as she says, from one artist to another. But it's almost as if, and this is an artist that we do include in the exhibition, how do you deal with this? It's this idea of creating a shared space. I think somebody mentioned that term on the first day. But also not wanting to imply a sort of influence between one artist and another. These kinds of correspondences seem to be contingent and shifting, to use those words again. But the same basic point, I think, could also be just as relevant when we think of Bourgeois and Szapocznikow, you know, two artists that actually know each other. Where not only their biographies, as we've seen, but their work, you know, suggests a kind of encounter or suggests a set of correspondences. This is Louise Bourgeois' Eccentric Growth from 1960, made, therefore, you know, around the same time that studio wall photograph was taken. And at the same time as she was making her latex sculpture. And it's a drawing that spreads out at the same time as it contains and lodges this kind of living concentration of matter. And here we have, on the other hand, Szapocznikows tumor from 1970. So obviously, you know, there are problems in relating these two works, I think. But also there's something resonant about the idea of a living thing contained or embedded in form in some way. I think I'll come back to that in a moment, but this idea of almost a model of growth that can be both creative and destructive simultaneously, that's neither one nor the other, that doesn't mean that an implication of a small fetus is the same as an implication of a cancerous tumor. Now, Bourgeois obviously outlives everybody. I mean, that's clear, living to the great age that she does. But even artists that are much younger than herself, and I think it's clear how interested she was in the work of artists younger than herself. I think, like Szapocznikow, for instance, but also another artist we've included in the exhibition, whose work you may already know, is the Estonian artist Anu Podor. Her rolled-up figure I'm showing you here, actually from much later, but you have this sense of Podor, who I think at this point in the 80s doesn't see a work by Louise Bourgeois, but she's teaching in the art school in Tallinn, teaching in relation to Bourgeois' work. So her knowledge of Bourgeois' work this is another rather amazing Anu Podor. In a way, as we know from my work on Eva Hesse, and I think is kind of so obvious we might not tend to think about it seriously enough, is how important it is that it's kind of slightly scrappy little illustrations in a book. For instance, Eva Hesse's work, as they were in those grainy black and white photographs in Lucy Lippard's great critical biography of Eva Hesse, how much that influenced kind of several generations of women artists, and certainly influenced artists who had not, in some respects, seen the work. But that way of the distribution of these ideas have themselves a kind of mobility and complexity to them. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that something about a visual imaginary, and that's one of the things we're trying to display and show and present in the exhibition. And few artists, of course, have as rich a storehouse of images as Bourgeois. But it's also a world, I guess, in which the dead and the living can kind of coexist as equals. And I'm quite interested in this idea of a cast of fictional protagonists, a kind of troupe, but a kind of troupe that fills your kind of mental space of the imagination, where these kinds of encounters that we've been thinking about can actually cross different periods, different time periods. And that might mean an artist in relation to her younger self as she looks back in order to look forward, as well as across and through all these possible iterations. So this is not so much to be foregrounded in the Oslo exhibition, but it's definitely part of the work and the research we've been doing for it, is this idea of treating historical protagonists almost in a similar way, not drawing so hard a fast distinction between the living and the dead. There are wonderful images that Bourgeois herself had. This she is given later, but it's an engraving by the Baroque printmaker Jacques Caillot. And Caillot, as you may know, created his sort of, they always seem like equivalent versions of, the disasters of war, like kind of post-Goya disasters of war for 17th century France. And they seem to me so intimately connected to sort of Bourgeois' visual imaginary. I wonder why one would demote this in favor of those contemporary protagonists that we've been talking about, or perhaps we should give it equal kind of footing in some ways, where, doesn't Bourgeois, for instance, create her own personal disaster series? I mean, that's one way of looking at Louise Bourgeois, that disaster for her is psychosexual, personal, subjective, as well as political and historical. There is this really powerful sense when you read her diaries, but also get the feel of how she, the images that she surrounded herself with, or the images that, the image world that interested her, is how much she was drawn to the Baroque, to the Rococo. They're in some ways closer to her, I always feel, than some of her to her contemporaries. I'm overstating it, but it seems to me part of the same thought experiment, potentially, that we're involved in here. For example, I know I'm going slightly off-piste, but she owned this example of 18th century rocaille. Rocaille, the patterns of ornament and decoration that created elaborate and forever deviating patterns of lines in frames or borders. It's been brilliantly described and discussed as a kind of system of confusion. And I think that's a pretty good description of some of Bourgeois' work, and certainly a good description of her wall of drawings. So in a way, I'm just suggesting that there's anonymous engravers, designers, as well as the more famous ones like Tello, for instance. Bourgeois is very erudite. She knows all of this. But also, works like this that you can see in early photographs of their apartment, but that sense of, what it means to think about an image like this that may, this pink dress, this awkward body, is this work, I don't mean so much the artist behind it necessarily, but is this work not as much a protagonist, potentially, in Bourgeois' imaginary as any of the artists that we've been discussing over the last couple of days? This is Untitled from 1996. Finally, though, I just wanted to come to a couple of works by the British sculptor Phillida Barlow. This is her object for Armchair from 1994. And then this on the right is her Pink Spree of 2018, alongside Bourgeois' Coyote, a wooden sculpture that she actually made in the 40s, the end of the 40s, and retitled in the 1970s, giving it the acronym of the American Sex Workers' Rights Organization, founded in California in the early 70s. Coyote stood for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. In some way, that that kind of renaming is very Louise Bourgeois. You know, you may not know that the famous Femmes, Maison paintings were not titled as such when they were first produced. It's hard to pin it down, but it seems that they were also retitled Femmes Maison, either at the end of the 60s or the early 70s, again at this same moment, and her more acute engagement with feminism at that point. So again, the sense of the kind of contingency of the work as it evolves. It suggests that they potentially figured differently to the artist by that point, or maybe she was just able to see something at that point about what the work had always been. I mean, the point is obviously not that it suddenly becomes a monument to sex work, but that it's part of this historically contingent and ever-evolving world that works speak to and can expand in a way out of their own time, making the idea that the artworks, as I said, the artwork's meaning is rooted in its own time. Such a truism of art history seem, at the very least, problematic. I haven't time to go into detail here, except to say that Phila de Barlow's Pink Spree itself was a work from 2018, but itself picked up on a motif that she'd been working with really since in various iterations, particularly in some of her drawings from the 1980s. So in a sense, there's a kind of delay, but rather than simply a formal comparison, I think what I want to suggest is how many of those layers of mediation are built up in that, are built into that comparison. And I guess what I'm trying to say that, you know, it's not just that these toppling structures are kind of a bit similar and the colours similar, but that Phila de Barlow, like Bourgeois, is an interlocutor with herself as much as with others. So just a few points bear with me, in conclusion of this provisional conclusion. Because I was thinking, you know, what are the consequences, in a way, of these lines of thought that we've been exploring over the last couple of days? And one very obvious one, perhaps, that barely needs stating, but I will, is the way in which it seems so imperative to avoid that traditional language of influence, you know, which we know is so unsatisfactory, but yet within the discipline of art history is so incredibly tenacious. I used it myself earlier in this talk, and I didn't want to waste time by, you know, it's kind of embedded in us. And I think, you know, the discussions have demonstrated in a way how one needs to think rather differently about these relations between the works of artists that we're engaging with. You know, creating a shared space, but also a confrontation. At the same time as trying to understand certain overarching historical structures. You know, I don't want to completely throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I don't want those structures to be related or confined simply to the art historical canon. I mean, for me, it has to engage also with something about the project of sculpture. Even though neither, say, Bourgeois or Szapocznikow really produce sculpture in a traditional sense. And this is, after all, the moment of the disintegration, the moment of the 1960s that we've been looking at, the moment of the disintegration of a certain conventional notion of what sculpture is. Now I would suggest that we don't have a consensus about what sculpture is. But I think the fact that we've gone from that point of disintegration to this point of not knowing even if there is something that we could call a project of sculpture is largely due to the work of the artist that we have been looking at. That itself has been played out in the work of the artists we've been looking at. But let's say there's something that approximates to a project of sculpture. Let's just hypothetically say that there is. If that is the case, the project of sculpture that these artists have presented us with, I think is one that shifts our attention very much to questions of sexuality and subjectivity, but also I want to claim a different kind of relationship to temporality, where temporality is absolutely embedded in the work. Not that it never was before, I don't want to create a kind of simplistic version that sculpture never had, but there's a shift in the nature of that engagement with temporality. After all, what happened in their work in the 1960s was an assault on sculpture. I mean, what's that latex piece, Lair, if it's not part of a disaster series? I'm really pleased that we looked at Akkadi, because that seems to me absolutely part of the same extraordinarily important movement, even if formally it has very little in common with those latex works. And what happens, secondly, to singularity? I think, was it Caroline Sproveri who brought that term up very, in the discussion, and I think it's incredibly important. What happens to the singularity of the work? Well, I think, and I hope that in trying to show this kind of constellation of conversations, imaginary and otherwise, that in the show that we're planning, that we show that both art is a product of a collective imaginary, is a collective process, but at the same time, while we make that point, we actually demonstrate and even dramatize the singularity that can be claimed for the individual artist working within that larger framework. And finally, what happens to specificity? That was a term that Griselda Pollock in her opening keynote brought up very forcibly. She referred, I think, to the psychosexual, the geopolitical, historical specificities that she felt were so important to hold on to. I think that's a really interesting and important question, but I also feel that we can't let ourselves be confined by the local, in the sense that art also speaks beyond its own specific locality and circumstances through the possibilities precisely of contingency. Art is always of its time and out of joint with its time. What else is it for Bourgeois and Szapocznikow to start making things out of marble in 1967? That, I think, is an important sort of sense of being out of joint and in joint at the same time. But for me, it's the specificities of the artwork that we also must, in the end, hold on to, because that's what holds this ever-shifting ground together, or kind of maintains perhaps a holding pattern for all these different contingent possibilities. And we've seen an incredible, all I can say is we've seen an incredibly rich array of such possibilities over the last couple of days. So thank you. Merci à tous. Okay.